You think she even knows what we're saying? Cole didn't whisper. He smirked as he said it, swirling his wine like the silence across from him was proof of victory. What he didn't realize, the quietest person in the room wasn't the one he needed to fear. Because just a few steps away, holding a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc with steady hands and eyes like sharpened glass, Nancy Davies was listening. And she understood everything. The restaurant was called Veritas, private, gilded, cold, a place where deals were whispered over Wagyu, and billion-dollar empires changed hands between bites. It sat at the top of a luxury Manhattan hotel like a crown, glass walls, velvet booths, and a table so long it needed its own zip code. Tonight that table seated men with global reach and wallets to match, but it was supposed to be her night. Yoshiko Shinohara, Japanese tech mogul, founder of Kaito Robotics, 45 years old, quiet, composed, a woman who built her empire without raising her voice and had no plans to start now. She sat at the head of the table like a stone in still water, no translator, no pleasantries, just presence, and that made the men across from her itch. Cole Harmon, CEO of Calix Global, was already losing patience. Next to him, Troy Beck, his silver-toothed second-in-command, was 3 drinks deep and twice as smug. They'd arrived expecting submission, smiles, signatures. What they got was silence, unapologetic, regal, sharp as steel. They mistook it for weakness. They mistook her for a formality to get through before the ink dried. They were wrong. And slipping between them all, barely seen, entirely overlooked, was Nancy Davies, 27, black, working a double shift in polished shoes and a burgundy apron that didn't belong in a room like this. She poured their wine, cleared their plates, dodged their stares. But what none of them realized, not Cole, not Troy, not even the maitre d' who forgot her name, was that Nancy had grown up in Sapporo. That Japanese wasn't just a language to her. It was muscle memory. It was the voice of her childhood, her identity, her mother's world. It was sacred. And tonight, that language, the one no one expected her to know, was going to become a blade. Because when Yoshiko whispered, soft and broken, "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy didn't hesitate. She didn't translate. Not yet. She heard her. She understood her. And somewhere inside, something cracked. A silence she had worn like armor for years began to peel away. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you, sometimes power doesn't speak first, but it always speaks last, because before Nancy Davies ever opened her mouth, she had already changed everything. They called it a partnership dinner, but everyone in the room knew what that really meant. Control, wrapped in courtesy, dressed in custom suits, served with a side of A5 Wagyu and $900 wine. Cole Harmon leaned back in his chair like he owned the building, one hand wrapped around his glass, the other gesturing lazily toward Yoshiko Shinohara. "She even understand a damn word we're saying?" He chuckled, not with humor, with certainty. Troy laughed louder. "Doesn't matter. A $2.3 billion buyout for some silent robotics queen? I'll take it. Let her nod all she wants." Nancy Davies tightened her grip on the wine bottle. Neither man looked at her. They never did. She was just the waitress, a blur in their periphery. But as she stepped back from the table, she caught Yoshiko's eyes. Still, steady, unblinking. And behind that silence smiled something deeper. A quiet that wasn't passive. It was watchful. The Veritas room held its breath in velvet and crystal, 12 seats around a table that cost more than Nancy's annual rent. Cole sat at one end, radiating ego. Yoshiko at the other, radiating nothing. It rattled him. He wanted warmth, gratitude, deference. Instead he got elegance and stillness, the kind of stillness that made powerful men twitch. Nancy poured Troy's wine next. He didn't glance up. "Chop chop, sweetheart. Don't make me die of thirst." The table laughed. Nancy didn't. She tilted the bottle. Smooth, controlled. Her hands were steady, her face neutral. But inside, rage was threading its way up her spine, not just at what they said, but at how freely they said it. like nothing in the room could push back, like no one in the room could even understand. Yoshiko's translator sat 2 seats down, expression unreadable. He offered polite summaries, 1 sentence at a time, just enough to keep the illusion of civility intact. But Nancy was reading more than words. She was reading the room, the glances, the half-laughed slurs, the way Cole leaned forward and slowed his voice like he was speaking to a child. "You need to understand, Ms. Shinohara, this deal isn't just generous, it's a golden parachute. And let's be real," Troy added, "without our infrastructure, Kaito's tech will never scale." Nancy nearly dropped the tray in her hand, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. They weren't making a deal. They were staging a takeover, and assuming she didn't get it. She stepped back into the corner of the room, half-shadowed, half-lit, invisible again, but not deaf, not dumb, not passive. She'd been taught to listen more than speak, raised in Japan, where silence had meaning, where listening was an act of honor, where respect lived in the folds of language. And now, in this glass castle of arrogance, that language rose again, quiet, wounded, resolute. Yoshiko shifted slightly, tilted her head toward her plate, whispered something in Japanese. It was soft, subtle, almost lost in the hum of clinking cutlery, but Nancy heard it. "Koko ni sai wa mite kureru hito ha inai no ka?" "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy's throat tightened. She stood still, wine bottle in hand, heart pounding, mouth dry. She looked at Yoshiko, and for the first time that night, Yoshiko looked back. No one else noticed. Not Cole, grinning into his bourbon, not Troy, checking his watch, not the manager in the back, glaring at Nancy to keep moving. But something had shifted, a current. A signal passed between 2 women who had never spoken, but already understood each other completely. Nancy didn't know what she'd do next. All she knew was this: she couldn't stay quiet much longer. And when she finally opened her mouth, the entire room would hear her. Nancy Davies knew how to disappear, not vanish, not fade, just slip quietly into the backdrop. It was something she'd been practicing since childhood. In classrooms where no one sat next to her, in boutiques where the staff followed her but never greeted her, in job interviews where they loved her resume and hired someone else. You learned after a while to be smaller, not just in voice but in presence, eyes down, smile soft, movements efficient. Don't be the problem, don't be too proud, don't be seen. At Veritas, that was the entire training manual. Flawless service, no opinions, seamless silence. And Nancy had mastered it. But tonight, something was unraveling. She hovered just inside the kitchen doors, back pressed to the steel, wine tray resting against her hip. The sounds of the restaurant blurred behind her. She wasn't thinking about tips. She wasn't thinking about clocking out. She was thinking about that voice. Yoshiko's voice. Soft, fragile, asking a question that didn't belong to the room, but still somehow reached her like it was meant for her. "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy had heard those words before. Not in sound, but in feeling. Sapporo, Japan. She was 8. Cold fingers clutching a thermos of miso soup at recess, her pink scarf tangled around her chin. The other kids hadn't questioned her skin. They didn't ask why her mother looked different or why her Japanese was flawless. They just accepted her. She belonged. Her mother, diplomatic, brilliant, endlessly exhausted, had been stationed there for 9 years. Nancy had learned honorifics before sarcasm. She bowed before she questioned. She absorbed the rhythm of language like it was breath. Japanese wasn't just a skill, it was home. Coming back to the States had been different. Suddenly her fluency wasn't impressive, it was unexpected. Her experience wasn't international, it was interesting, and somehow she was always explaining herself. Too black to be a cultural expert, too fluent to be just a waitress, too smart to be overlooked, and still, always overlooked. Now, standing at the edge of that dining room, watching men in suits deconstruct a woman they didn't understand, Nancy felt something rising. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was recognition. Because Yoshiko wasn't being ignored by accident. She was being erased on purpose. Nancy returned to the room, slowly, carefully, mask back on. Cole was mid-rant about market shares and intellectual property. Troy was pretending to care. Yoshiko was silent again, but this time, Nancy understood what that silence cost. She collected an empty plate. Her fingers brushed against a document left open on the table. Fine print, legalese, predatory terms wrapped in polished language. She didn't read the whole thing, but she saw enough. And now her silence wasn't just strategic, it was loaded. She moved to Yoshiko's side, clearing a dish with practiced ease. Yoshiko didn't look at her, didn't need to. Their eyes had already met once. That was enough. Back in the kitchen, Nancy's manager barked orders about pacing, wine pairings, dessert delays. She nodded on instinct, didn't say a word. But her heart was beating harder now. Her breath came tighter. Her hands trembled just slightly. Something inside her had shifted, the way it had years ago during a school play in Kyoto when a teacher told her, "Your voice doesn't belong in this role." Not because she couldn't pronounce the lines, but because she wasn't meant to stand center stage. Tonight felt like that again, only this time she wasn't 8, and this time she wasn't leaving the stage. Back in the dining room, the laughter had faded. The power had settled, cocky and lopsided. Nancy stepped forward, silent, polished, composed, still unseen, but not for long, because behind her quiet hands and waitress uniform, Nancy Davies was no longer just watching. She was deciding. And when the moment came, she'd be ready. The steak knives gleamed under the candlelight. Not a speck on the plates, not a crease in the linen, not a single voice raised. But the room was getting colder, not in temperature, in tone. The kind of cold that came dressed as formality, that moved through legal language and careful smiles, pretending not to bite. Cole leaned forward, elbows on the table, tapping a pen against a thick contract in front of him. "We'll handle the stateside rollout. You keep your name on the tech. Win-win." He smiled like he was doing her a favor. Across from him, Yoshiko remained silent. She picked up her glass, sipped, set it back down. That was it. Cole's smile thinned. Troy slid a second folder across the table. "There's an updated clause," he said casually, "just to clarify post-acquisition usage." Nancy watched from behind. She wasn't pouring wine now. She wasn't clearing plates. She was still, eyes locked on the document sitting just inches from Yoshiko's untouched dessert. Her manager would have snapped if he saw her pause like this, but he wasn't watching. No one was except Yoshiko. And Yoshiko's fingers hadn't moved. Nancy inched closer, her tray clutched against her chest. She didn't read every word, but she recognized the structure. A decade-long non-compete. An IP transfer clause so broad it might as well have said, "Everything she's ever invented now belongs to us." Buried in elegant font and phrases like efficiency, consolidation, and equity realignment. Predatory, dressed in politeness. Nancy had seen it before, not here, but in embassy meetings, in policy briefings she'd overheard as a child, in contracts whispered through diplomacy and disguised as generosity. This wasn't a merger, it was a silencing. Troy clinked his glass to Cole's. "We're practically teammates now." Cole laughed. Yoshiko didn't react, but Nancy saw it. A flicker, a subtle tightening at the corner of her mouth. The restraint of someone who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how little respect was being offered. Nancy took a step back, breathed, focused. Her instincts told her to stay quiet. Her training told her not to interfere, but her spine had gone rigid. She could feel it in her legs, in her chest, in her fingertips. That moment, where silence becomes unbearable, where watching starts to feel like complicity. Troy looked at Yoshiko and chuckled. "I mean, if there's anything confusing in the paperwork, I'm sure your translator can—" "Clarify?" Cole finished, flashing teeth. "We kept it simple, don't worry." Yoshiko blinked once, slowly. Nancy felt heat rising behind her eyes. It wasn't just arrogance, it was intent. They weren't miscommunicating. They were counting on miscommunication. Nancy stepped forward, just slightly. She wasn't sure what she was doing. She just needed to move. The translator sat still, hands folded. He hadn't touched the updated file. Yoshiko's hand hovered over it and then pulled away, not out of confusion, out of clarity. Nancy knew that kind of pause. It was the pause before surrender. The moment you weighed dignity against consequence, the room hummed with false civility. A cage, polished, padded, perfectly lit, but still a cage. And Nancy Davies, the girl who wasn't supposed to exist in this space, was standing at its edge, pulse pounding, breath shallow, every muscle screaming to speak. Not yet, but close. So close. Because this wasn't just about a contract anymore. It was about power. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? And who gets to decide what silence means? The wine was beginning to run low. Nancy felt it before she saw it. Troy's eyes flicking toward the bottle, then toward her, like she wasn't a person, but a button that hadn't been pushed yet. She was already moving before he made a sound. Almost. Snap. Fingers. Sharp. Quick. Dismissive. Hey, sweetheart. More of that Sauvignon. Chop chop. The words hit like a slap wearing silk gloves. She froze for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for anyone to notice, but inside, something cracked. Nancy walked to the table, her hands steady, her steps silent. She didn't look at him, didn't smile. She poured the wine slowly, measured. Troy didn't thank her. He never did. Cole kept talking, breezing through numbers like this deal was already closed. We've mapped out Phase 1, US rollout by Q4, EU by next summer. Assuming regulatory clearance, of course. He laughed at his own line. Yoshiko said nothing. Nancy refilled the glass. Still quiet, still invisible, but inside, her heartbeat was crawling up her throat. Troy leaned back in his chair, loose and smug. He cut his eyes toward Yoshiko and spoke louder now. Still no comment. You sure we didn't buy a statue? A couple of the other execs chuckled under their breath. Nancy's grip tightened around the neck of the bottle, not enough to break it, but almost. She turned to leave, and then she saw it. A new document slid halfway across the table. Different color tab, different font, smaller print. She caught a phrase. Transfer of proprietary algorithms upon signature. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to read the rest. They weren't buying Kaito Robotics. They were trying to own Yoshiko, erase her code, her voice, her future, with a pen and a smile. Nancy stepped back into the shadows, the wine bottle cold in her hand. Her manager was watching now. She could feel it. The side glance from across the room, the invisible leash pulling her back into line. But it was too late. Something had changed. Inside her, the dam was starting to buckle. And then Yoshiko spoke, barely above a whisper, in Japanese. Jenshu wo hanaseru hito ha koko ni inai no ka? Is there no one here who speaks truth? Nancy's breath caught. She turned, not dramatically, not loudly, just turned, toward her. Yoshiko was staring directly at her now, not past her, not through her, at her. Nancy stepped forward, a single movement, deliberate, controlled. She set the bottle down on the white linen tablecloth, both hands. Then slowly, and she bowed. Not the kind of nod people give when they're sorry to interrupt. The kind of bow that came from memory, from reverence, from something deeper than apology. It was the bow of someone raised in a culture of respect, and done being disrespected. Every fork froze, every glass paused mid-air, every man at that table went still. Troy blinked. Cole tilted his head like he'd missed something, and Nancy lifted her head, eyes forward, voice steady. For the first time all night, she spoke. Shinohara-sama. May I translate? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric, like the room itself had been rewired. Yoshiko's eyes didn't widen, she didn't smile. She simply nodded. Once, slowly, and just like that. The room flipped. Nancy Davies was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the waitress. She was a weapon, and her voice had just been unsheathed. Nobody moved. The wine stopped mid-pour. The knives hung in the air like questions, and Nancy's voice, calm, clear, unexpected, cut through the hush like silk slicing paper. "Shinohara-sama, may I translate?" Yoshiko's eyes never left hers. A single nod, quiet, measured. That nod shattered the room. Troy's mouth parted like he was about to speak, but no sound came out. Cole leaned forward slowly, like the table was suddenly unstable beneath him. "You speak Japanese?" he asked. Not curious, accusing, like her fluency was theft. Nancy didn't answer him. She turned back to Yoshiko, bowed once more, then stood tall. "With your permission, I'd like to interpret your response to their proposal." Yoshiko folded her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. "Hi," she said. "Please." Nancy faced the table. 12 seats, 12 men who had spent the last hour laughing, negotiating, mocking, assuming. Her voice didn't tremble. "Ms. Shinohara would like to clarify that she has read every clause in the contract and that she understands fully." She paused. Eyes met hers, narrowed, blinking, shifting. She let the silence sit for a moment. She also requests the removal of the non-compete clause, the IP transfer provision, and the relocation restriction disguised under Section 14.3. The room cracked, right down the center. Cole reached for his bourbon but missed the glass. Troy leaned forward. Wait, what are you even—" "You buried it in subclauses," Nancy said, still even. "Language designed to be missed, unless someone knew what to look for." Her hands were steady at her sides. She found it. A low cough came from the translator, who hadn't moved since Nancy stepped in. Yoshiko gave him a single glance. He lowered his head. Troy recovered first. "This is highly inappropriate," he barked. "She's a waitress." Cole raised a hand. "Hold on." He looked at Nancy like she had just crawled out from under the rug with a secret he'd left behind. "Where did you learn Japanese?" "Sapporo," Nancy answered. "I lived there for 10 years. Another silence, this one heavier, more uncertain. "And I'm not just a waitress," she added. "Not tonight." The table seemed smaller now, the chandeliers dimmer. Nancy glanced down at the open document, so neat, so curated, and then back at the men who wrote it. "This contract doesn't reflect a partnership," she said. "It reflects a trap." Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. "And Ms. Shinohara deserves the truth. Not a translation filtered through diplomacy, but the truth." She turned back to Yoshiko. A softer bow. A private moment in a public war. "Shinohara-sama," she said in Japanese. "Do I have your trust to continue?" "Yes," Yoshiko replied. "Please, say everything." Nancy turned, not to explain, to reveal. Clause 9.4 allows for indefinite usage of proprietary software, without credit, without compensation. Clause 11.2 restricts her from developing future technologies without your written approval, even if she walks away from this deal. Every face shifted. Some flushed, some paled. The power was slipping, they could feel it. And Nancy was still speaking. "You're not offering her a partnership. You're offering her silence, disguised as synergy, covered in compliments." She stepped back, hands at her sides, eyes unwavering. "She says no." The room collapsed into stunned quiet. Cole didn't move. Troy sat back in his chair like the ceiling had dropped 2 inches. Nancy waited, calm, composed. She had more to say. But not yet. Not until someone else broke the silence. And in the space between what had just happened and what came next, you could feel it. A reckoning had entered the room. Silence stretched across the room. But it wasn't empty, it was loaded, with tension, with confusion, with something dangerously close to panic. Troy shifted first, reaching for a napkin he didn't need. Cole's mouth opened slightly, like he was still deciding between outrage and damage control. Nancy didn't flinch. She didn't backpedal. She stepped closer to the table. "There's more." No one told her to stop. No one could. Clause 12.1 grants indefinite license to all existing and future AI models under Kaito's umbrella. without attribution. Clause 15.7 restricts public commentary from Ms. Shinohara for up to 10 years on any topic related to the company or its technologies. She let that sink in. It's a gag order. And a theft, wrapped in flattery, hidden behind translation. Across the table, Yoshiko remained still, but something in her face had shifted. Her silence no longer looked cautious, it looked sharp, intentional, alive. Troy stood. This is a breach of protocol. She's not authorized to— No, Nancy interrupted. She's finally being heard. Her voice was still soft, but steel was threading through every word now. You didn't want a partner, you wanted a name, a face for your press release, and the second she signed, her voice disappeared. Nancy turned to Yoshiko again. The room watched, unblinking. Would you like me to continue, Shinohara-sama? Yoshiko looked toward her translator, then toward Nancy. Yes, she said. Please continue. Nancy reached forward and turned the page. One flip. That's all it took. At the top in bold, retention of ownership rights, international clauses. Clause 18.3 transfers full control of Kaito's neural interface blueprints to Calyx, effective immediately upon signing. No option for reversal, no clause for retraction. She looked at Cole. You knew she wouldn't agree to that, that's why you counted on the silence. That's why you counted on her needing you. Cole stood now too, his voice tighter than before. I don't know what you think you're doing. I think I'm saying what no one else in this room had the courage to. Nancy's eyes didn't leave his. I think I'm translating exactly what she's too polite to say herself. Behind her, a quiet click. A small device slid onto the table, black, round, unassuming. Yoshiko reached forward and pressed play. A voice echoed through the room. Cole's. She won't read it, just nods and signs. Sushi doll doesn't even blink. Then Troy's laugh. Let's just get her to ink it and celebrate. By the time she figures it out, we'll own her code and her silence. Then static. Then nothing. No one moved. The chandeliers above them suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. Nancy watched as the men's faces turned colorless. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everything was already loud enough. Yoshiko leaned forward for the first time all night, calm, collected, clear. She spoke in English. Now that we all understand each other, I'll be renegotiating. With her. She looked directly at Nancy. No one argued. They couldn't. And somewhere behind them, footsteps approached. Fast. Angry. Nancy's manager. Storming in with a voice already raised. And a consequence she didn't yet know was about to miss its mark. The room didn't breathe. The last words still hovered in the air like smoke. I'll be renegotiating. With her. Nancy didn't move, didn't speak. Her heartbeat filled her ears, but her body stayed still. It was done. The lie was exposed. The balance shattered. And then, the door slammed open. Nancy! Her manager's voice sliced through the silence, loud, angry, familiar. He stormed in red-faced, gripping a towel like a weapon and waving toward the table as if no one important was sitting there. What the hell do you think you're doing? Everyone turned, except Nancy. She didn't flinch, but her eyes dropped to the wine bottle she'd set down earlier. Still there, uncorked, undisturbed. A reminder of the role she'd just outgrown. I asked you a question, her manager snapped. Are you out of your mind? You don't speak in this room. You don't interrupt private business. She faced him now. Not defensive, not apologetic, just calm. He stepped closer. Too close. You're done. Turn in your apron. And get the hell out before you make it worse. The words hit hard, but they didn't land. Nancy had already left the version of herself that would have cowered. She just looked past him, to Yoshiko, to the woman who had hurt her. And that's when another voice entered the room, deeper, steady, measured. She's not leaving. Every head turned. From the shadows of a neighboring table, a man stood. Tall, dignified, charcoal grey suit, presence like gravity. Nancy blinked. She hadn't noticed him before. No one had. But now, he owned the space. In fact, he said, she just saved your entire negotiation. Cole's expression fell flat. Marcus? The man gave a slight nod. Marcus Bell, major investor, silent board member of Kaito Robotics, and apparently watching everything from the beginning. Marcus turned to Nancy. His tone softened, but never lost authority. Miss Davies, I've been listening, and I want to personally thank you and for protecting the integrity of this company. He turned back to her manager, and I'm going to be very clear. If she walks out of this restaurant without respect, compensation, and protection, there will be consequences far beyond your payroll. The manager's jaw locked. She's a waitress. She's a translator, Marcus said, a cultural strategist, and after tonight, something more. Troy sat frozen. Cole looked like he'd swallowed glass. Yoshiko hadn't moved since she spoke. She didn't need to. The room had already turned in her direction. And Nancy? She was still standing in the same spot. But the ground beneath her had changed. She was no longer on the defensive, no longer shrinking. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for approval. She was being seen. Her manager backed away without another word. Nancy looked down at the apron tied around her waist. She untied it, folded it once, and laid it gently on the service station beside her, not because she was finished, but because she was ready. And when she looked back up, every eye was on her, not out of curiosity, not surprise, but recognition. Nancy stood in silence. No tray, no apron, no orders to follow. Just her breath, steady in her chest, and the weight of 12 stunned men staring back at her like she'd rewritten gravity. Across the room, Troy reached for his bourbon with a trembling hand. He missed the glass. Cole had stopped blinking entirely, and her manager, gone, disappeared through the service doors without a word. Marcus Bell stepped closer, still calm, still composed. Miss Davies, he said, you've done more in 10 minutes than this team managed in 2 months. Nancy said nothing. She wasn't used to being praised out loud, especially not in rooms like this. But something in Marcus's tone made it land differently, not performative, not patronizing, genuine. You didn't just translate words, he said. You protected intent. You preserved dignity. You saw what no one else bothered to. Then he turned to Yoshiko. Miss Shinohara, your move. Yoshiko stood, for the first time all night. She didn't adjust her sleeves. She didn't clear her throat. She simply stepped forward, graceful, grounded, until she was standing beside Nancy. Then, with every man still watching, she reached out and gently took Nancy's hand. You saw me, she said, when no one else would. A pause. Then softly, would you allow me to return the favor? Nancy blinked. The room disappeared. Just her and Yoshiko now, the woman she'd once only served from a distance, now standing beside her, like an equal. Yoshiko turned to Marcus. Extend her a formal offer. He nodded. With pleasure. Then to Nancy. How would you feel about joining Kaito Robotics as an executive liaison and cultural strategist? A silence. But this time it was warm, alive. Relocation included, Marcus added. Tuition assistance, housing, 6-figure salary. Nancy's lips parted. She tried to speak, but nothing came. Not at first, because for so long her voice had been buried under everyone else's, but now it returned, shaky, small, but hers. I'd be honored. No one clapped, no one dared. The same men who had laughed at her, snapped their fingers, ignored her presence, now watched her walk out of the service corner and she didn't raise her chin, didn't gloat, didn't boast. She simply moved, with quiet certainty, with the dignity she had always carried, now finally reflected back. Yoshiko walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside her, and in that polished glass dining room where contracts were once written to erase, a new chapter had just been signed, one without ink, one with intention. And every man at that table could do nothing but watch. The dining room felt different now, not quieter, stiller, like the air itself understood something had shifted. Nancy stood in the middle of it. No tray, no apron, no more pretending. Just her, and the silence she now owned. Yoshiko hadn't let go of her hand. She didn't need to. The gesture wasn't for optics, it wasn't theater, it was truth. For the first time in hours, Nancy wasn't moving plates or reading documents. She wasn't interpreting contracts or translating power plays. She was simply standing still, and still the room revolved around her. Marcus Bell cleared his throat gently. "We'll send a formal letter," he said, "but the position is yours if you want it." Nancy looked at him, then at Yoshiko, whose face held no pressure, only clarity, only calm. "Executive liaison," Marcus continued. "Full relocation. Flexible start date. We'll cover the remainder of your graduate program, wherever you choose to attend." He paused. "Salary starts at $180. For a moment, Nancy didn't speak. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't trust her voice not to shake. She looked at her hands, still open at her sides, no longer clenching anything. Then she looked at the table, at the men who hadn't said a word since she spoke. Cole's face was blank. Troy's jaw was set tight. They didn't speak now because they couldn't, because they knew. This wasn't just an offer. It was a reckoning. Nancy inhaled slowly, then met Yoshiko's gaze. "Shinohara-sama," she said softly. "Your voice deserves to be heard, and so does mine." She turned back to Marcus, finally steady. "Yes," she said. "I accept." Yoshiko gave the smallest of nods, not ceremonial, not scripted, a gesture of deep, mutual respect. Nancy bowed, not as a server, not as a translator, as a woman, as a force. They began to walk toward the exit, together, step by step, shoulder to shoulder. Each footfall sounded louder than it should have, or maybe that was just the silence they left behind, the same silence that once erased her, now parted for her. At the door, Nancy paused, not to look back, but to breathe, to feel it. The weight that had been on her shoulders for years, gone. She didn't need to be loud. She didn't need to make a scene. She'd already done the one thing no one expected. She stood her ground and changed the ending. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. Yoshiko followed. And as the doors slid shut behind them, the dining room stood frozen. No applause, no recognition, just the echo of something irreversible. The story of a woman they tried to erase, walking out beside one they never truly saw, and rewriting the future with every step. Sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones rewriting the ending.